Did Ulysses really exist? Welcome to Collapse, where history comes alive, and each video immerses you in the fate of those who shaped the world. Today, get ready to embark on one of the greatest journeys of human imagination. Across raging seas, enchanted islands, and the wrath of the gods, one name constantly resurfaces, like a whisper carried by the waves: Ulysses, hero of countless wiles, king of Ithaca, survivor of Troy. He has traversed the ages in the songs of Homer and the dreams of humanity. Cyclops, sirens, storms, and divine curses punctuate his journey. But behind the epics, a question remains. Did Ulysses really exist? Was he a forgotten king of the Bronze Age whose memory was amplified by legend, a symbol of human trials, or the echo of a sailor whose story was sculpted by poets? But before embarking on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to miss nothing. Thank you, and bon voyage. The Late Bronze Age, approximately corresponding to the period from 1500 to 1200 BC, marks a particularly dynamic moment in the history of the Near East and the Mediterranean basin. During this era, great powers expand and compete in various fields such as politics, commerce, and technological innovation. The exchange flows and cultural contacts multiply, promoting the circulation of prestige objects, rare raw materials, and even military know-how. This phase is characterized by a relatively elaborate international organization in which major royal courts maintain structured diplomatic relations sealed by princely marriages or sumptuous gifts. For today's audience, not very familiar with the alliances and conflicts of this distant time, it is essential to understand the dominant position of certain civilizations and the rise of regions previously considered peripheral. The New Kingdom of Egypt, beginning around 1550 BC, holds one of the leading roles in the Near East due to the power of its pharaohs and the prosperity of its fertile lands. Under the reign of Amenhotep III, sometimes called Amenhotep III, Egypt experiences a phase of stability and artistic flourishing. Monumental temples like the one at Luxor testify to the cultural and religious wealth of this kingdom. A few decades later, Ramses II in 1279 BC perpetuates this grandeur, particularly through his military campaigns and his art of propaganda. To the north, the Hittite Empire, centered in central Anatolia, asserts itself as a leading power after the unification of various local principalities. Its rulers, such as Suppiluliuma Thussar, expand towards Syria, directly competing with the pharaohs for control of trade routes and strategic cities. Meanwhile, there is the flourishing of Syro-Mesopotamian kingdoms, like the influential kingdom of Ugarit, known for its active port and cultured literacy, or the Mitanni, consolidating its power over a vast area stretching between the Tigris and the Euphrates. In this context, the geopolitical balance thrives on meticulously negotiated diplomatic dealings. Marriages between dynasties, exchanges of ambassadors, and non-aggression pacts are part of the landscape. Archives discovered on sites like Amarna in Egypt or Hattusa in Anatolia reveal the intensity of these official contacts. For example, some Amarna letters mention correspondences between the pharaoh and various Near Eastern kings, where each seeks to ensure access to imports of valuable materials such as cedarwood or tin, essential for bronze production. In Mitanni, elites cultivate alliances with Egypt to curb Hittite expansion, while Ugarit's princes leverage their maritime position to foster a dynamic trade boom in the eastern Mediterranean. Thus, these major civilizations are intimately interconnected, ensuring the relative stability of the region for several generations. In parallel, the Western Mediterranean and European regions are also undergoing significant changes during the same period. On the island of Sardinia, the Nuragic culture develops around monumental stone towers called nuragis, which serve as both fortifications and community centers. These structures, often erected on elevated positions, testify to a structured social organization and trade relations with other Mediterranean lands. Furthermore, the Atlantic coasts of Europe host a crucial supply network for tin, essential for bronze production. Cornwall, in the extreme southwest of present-day England, constitutes one of the main sources of this white metal. Navigators of the time eagerly brave sometimes hostile seas to procure this coveted resource. In the Aegean region, there is also the gradual arrival of Doric populations, who will later leave their mark on Greece during the Iron Age. Although archaeological evidence of these migratory movements remains limited, legends and oral traditions highlight the impact of these new lineages on the linguistic and political configuration of future Hellas. Thus, the Western Mediterranean and Europe are not on the sidelines, but participate in the general dynamics characterizing the end of the Bronze Age. While these societies take advantage of varied material riches, they are also distinguished by remarkable technological and cultural advances. Cuneiform writing, born in Mesopotamia, remains widely used in the Hittite world and its zones of influence for drafting treaties, inventories, or official correspondence. In Egypt, hieroglyphic writing holds a sacred dimension, but it also adapts to administrative needs, notably through the use of hieratic, a simplified cursive form. Economically, the island of Cyprus occupies a key position in the distribution of copper, an essential component of bronze. Ships regularly depart from its ports to transport this ore to various destinations, from the Syro-Palestinian coasts to the Aegean ports. Moreover, the advent of the lightweight spoked war chariot marks a revolution in conducting battles. More maneuverable and swift, this vehicle spreads to several armies, whether it be Egypt, the Hittites, or even Achaean formations. Artisans indeed adapt the techniques of wood assembly and wheel fabrication to make these chariots extremely mobile on the field, emphasizing the strategic importance of light cavalry during these incessant conflicts. In the south of mainland Greece, the Mycenaean civilization flourished during the same chronological window, thus firmly situating itself within the sphere of influence of the Late Bronze Age. Mycenae, located in the region of Argolis, is one of the most emblematic citadels, thanks to its Cyclopean walls and the Lion Gate, a masterpiece of monumental architecture of the time. Like their eastern counterparts, the Mycenaean kings built vast palace fortresses that serve as administrative, religious, and economic centers. On these sites, scribes record crucial information in Linear B, a writing system derived from Minoan Linear A, but adapted to the archaic Greek language. The tablets discovered at Pylos, Knossos, and of course at Mycenae inform us about the organization of labor, the management of agricultural stocks, and local religious rituals. This administrative centralization reflects a powerful hierarchical structure where each surrounding region contributes its tribute in goods and labor, highlighting the logistical strength of these Achaean kingdoms. Commerce holds a central place in the prosperity of Mycenaean elites. Among the most prized commodities is perfumed oil, made from olive oil enhanced with aromatic essences. This luxury product, coveted throughout the Near East, often serves as a diplomatic gift during exchanges between royal courts. Stirrup jars, characteristic of Mycenaean production, have been found at various archaeological sites from the Levantine coast to Egypt, attesting to the geographical reach of these networks. In return, the Achaeans import precious materials such as gold, ivory, or exotic substances for goldsmithing and palace decoration. Greek embassies, indirectly attested in some Eastern documents, sometimes traveled to Syrian or Egyptian courts, strengthening these political and commercial ties. Far from being isolated, The citadels of Mycenae and its neighbors thus engage in active dialogue with the great powers of their time. Recent discoveries also suggest that the Mycenaeans, aware of their growing status, participate in formal diplomatic initiatives. Prestige objects, such as cups made of noble metals or finely crafted jewelry, circulate from one court to another as gifts sealing treaties or military pacts. In some cases, Mycenaean artisans even seem to have traveled to Asia Minor or Phoenicia to export their expertise, particularly in making luxurious adornments. This mobility fosters the emergence of a cosmopolitan elite, familiar with artistic styles and religious practices, sometimes very different from its Aegean cradle. Intercultural exchanges also permeate the religious domain, with Eastern influences evident in the construction of Mycenaean sanctuaries, while some deities may have been adopted or assimilated into local forms. Thus, Mycenae is fully part of this networked world, where a kingdom's power is measured as much by its alliances as by its economic potential. At the heart of mainland Greece, the Mycenaean civilization develops around a strongly hierarchical political system. At the head of this structure is the wanax, a term generally translated as king. This title appears in the linear B tablets, found notably at sites such as Pylos or Knossos in Crete, then under Mycenaean domination. The wanax is not only an administrative ruler, but also bears a sacred character, linking the divine sphere to the human one. In the religious context of the time, the king presides over official ceremonies, coordinates the maintenance of sanctuaries, and manages the supply of offerings. His status, elevated above other dignitaries, is reflected in the distribution of goods and lands, as well as in artistic representations such as sculptures and frescoes, where a royal figure often appears larger or more richly adorned than his subjects. Just below the wanax is the lauagetas, literally conductor of troops or war leader. This title implies a leading military role, though there are ongoing scholarly debates regarding its scope. Some specialists believe the lauagetas could be a relative of the wanax, acting as an emissary or regent in matters of defense. His mission would extend to the supervision of regional contingents, with the equipment and recruitment noted in royal inventories. The linear B tablets mention lists of men and resources, such as bronze for making weapons, under the military authority's responsibility. In this era, marked by frequent conflicts among neighboring citadels, cohesion and quick response are crucial. A strong military leader is therefore an essential asset. Below these two major figures, Mycenaean power relies on a network of vassals and local officials. The collectors, QE Terapo, are responsible for gathering levies and sending them to the palaces, the central elements of the political organization. Each fief or district, often centered around a secondary fortress, must account to the palace for the distribution of resources, whether cereals, wine, perfumed oil, or stocks of precious metals. Local elites seek to maintain harmony with royal power, as their own prosperity depends on the support of the central administration. Relations are thus based on a subtle balance between protection, military service, and wealth redistribution, particularly during grand royal feasts. This system, although structured and vertical, is not fixed. The archives hint at internal rivalries, sometimes linked to the ambition of certain lords or to succession disputes. These tensions appear subtly in the administrative vocabulary, but the true extent of the struggles is unknown. Nevertheless, the existence of this tight hierarchy, crowned by a king with a politico-religious role, remains a strong marker of Achaean power during the 15th to 13th centuries BC. In this climate, Mycenae in Argolis stands out for its impressive fortifications, its richly adorned royal tombs, like the Tholos tombs, and its diplomatic influence. Other sites, like Sirens or Pylos, adopt a similar model: a palace fortress, a king, a military leader, and a group of vassals forming the backbone of Mycenaean politics. When we talk about Ithaca in the Mycenaean context, the first question that arises is its identification in the linear B tablets. Most of the preserved documents come from Pylos, Knossos, or Thebes, and focus on the distribution of resources, deliveries of raw materials, or the management of specialized labor. Among the listed toponyms, some researchers suggest that Ikoto, often transcribed Ekokto or Ekokto, and Ataka na Wo, could refer to the island of Ithaca or its surroundings. However, the interpretation of these forms remains debated. The nature of the tablets, centered on administrative topics, offers little precision about the exact locality to which these names refer. A recurring debate consists of knowing whether Ikoto is simply a district attached to Pylos, or if it designates an insular area offshore. According to some hypotheses, scribes recorded the amounts of goods received or sent to various provinces, and the use of unusual terms might reveal a more distant area. Ithaca, located in the Ionian archipelago, could have been an observation post or a commercial outpost. The island, mountainous and modest in size compared to the mighty Mycenae, nevertheless remains absent from many official lists. This observation might either mean Ithaca did not play a major economic role, or its name appeared in a cryptic form, unique to Mycenaean terminology. Alongside Ikoto, the expression Ataka Nawo is sometimes read as Ithaca Nawo, reminiscent of Nawo of Ithaca in a hypothetical linguistic reconstruction. The element Nawo, Akantunawi Jo, may refer to a sanctuary or a religious center. The theories vary, and no definitive archaeological evidence confirms the equation Ataka Sarcher Ithaca. Nevertheless, the presence of toponyms ending in Ka is common in Mycenaean Greece, which fuels the idea that Ithaca could have been integrated into the Achaean census system. For today's audience, less familiar with the details of linear B philology, it is worth noting that if the island appears in the archives, it is never named unambiguously. Yet, the legendary influence that Ithaca would later take, notably through the figure of Odysseus, potentially finds roots in these textual fragments. This philological discussion fits into a broader context. Mycenaean palaces attested to a rather extensive control of the Ionian maritime space. Ships of commerce and war sailed the waters between the Balkan Peninsula, Crete, and the Anatolian coasts. Ithaca, a small island, could have played various roles: a maritime stopover, a refuge for a reduced fleet, or a diplomatic outpost. The question remains open, and the debates continue. This historical uncertainty largely feeds future epic interpretations and gives Ithaca its elusive character in the literary tradition, which will culminate with the Odyssey. The Mycenaean elites, whether the Wanaks, the Lawagetas, or certain vassal lords, distinguished themselves by sophisticated military equipment. Among the emblematic pieces, the boar's tusk helmet stands at the forefront. Made from tusk plates sewn onto a leather or felt base, it was a sign of prestige. It was not simple to make. The number of boar tusks needed, combined with the preparation time, made it a rare and expensive item. Symbolically, this type of helmet recalled the strength and boldness needed to face both the wild animal and the enemy. In the Homeric Iliad, we find references to this helmet, testifying to a memory continuity between the end of the Bronze Age and the archaic oral epics. Another major element of protection is the Dendra panoply, named after its discovery at the site of Dendra in Argolis. It is a composite bronze armor that extensively covers the torso and shoulders. Its segmented parts allow for a certain degree of mobility, although the whole set remains heavy. The archaeological find also includes greaves and forearm guards, showing how seriously the Mycenaeans took armed conflicts. This type of armor, dating back to the late 15th century BC, illustrates the technological evolution of bronze metallurgy. Mycenaean forges mastered the casting and hammering of large plates, reflecting an advanced craftsmanship that required not only skill, but also resources in tin and copper, sometimes imported from far away, Cyprus for copper, Cornwall or the Iberian Peninsula for tin, according to some hypotheses. At sea, the Mycenaeans deployed galleys with about 20 oars, more precisely 10 oars on each side, maneuvered by trained crews. These ships had an elongated hull, designed for speed and coastal navigation. The ability to transport men and goods allowed Achaean kings to quickly conduct raids toward enemy shores or control essential trade routes. The trade of perfumed oil, fine ceramics, or metals made the palaces wealthy, and the protection of maritime convoys was crucial. Naval strategies, poorly known in written sources, may have involved blockade maneuvers or, on the contrary, escorting merchant fleets. In some Hittite tradition texts, there are mentions of Ahiyawan, a Hittite term commonly used to designate the Achaeans, who possessed significant maritime power. Although fragmentary, these sources indicate that the Aegean Sea and its surroundings were a true theater of military operations. This art of warfare is complemented by a complex logistical organization, supplying food for troops, transporting bronze, or distributing spoils. The Linear B tablets record, among other things, the distribution of rations for contingents in different demes, local administrative units. The capacity to collect, store, and redistribute these resources reinforces, once again, the authority of the Wanaks. From simple garrisons to major offensives, each operation requires a clear chain of command, including not only the military leader, but also mid-ranking officers, scribes, and craftsmen responsible for weapon production. Among the fascinating objects left by the Mycenaean civilization, there is a small steatite seal discovered in the western region of Greece, although its exact provenance remains debated. This seal, over 3,000 years old, bears a striking representation. A male figure, wearing a short tunic, stands near a boar, or at least an animal that strongly resembles one. The image is stylized, as is often the case in Mycenaean glyptic art, but the association of man and boar has intrigued specialists for decades. Why does this motif give rise to the idea of a prince of Ithaca? Several hypotheses are suggested. Firstly, the presence of the boar recalls the tusked helmet described earlier. In Mycenaean iconography, there is a valorization of the battle against the boar, seen as an act of heroism. Secondly, Homeric tradition closely links Odysseus and the ordeal of the boar, notably the scar he received while hunting such an animal in his youth. This fuels the imagination of some historians who see in this seal an indirect testimony of the bravery associated with a lineage or a local king, possibly based in Ithaca. According to this reading, engraving a boar would refer to the identity or familial totem of an insular leader. However, caution is advised. There is no inscription accompanying the seal to read a name. Also, the human figure does not systematically carry a royal attribute. Furthermore, the practice of personal seals went beyond the royal use. Merchants, officers, scribes could also have seals adorned with animal symbols to mark property or seal jars of precious commodities. Many seals found in Crete and mainland Greece depict lions, bulls, or griffins, reflecting the importance accorded to animal power and strength. The boar, in this context, holds a particular place due to its anchoring in the warrior and mythical register. This object, though modest in size, offers a glimpse into the cultural and symbolic universe of the Achaeans. It illustrates how the animal symbol functions both as an image of power, an emblem of bravery, and an echo of the elite's hunting practices, which testify to a certain social status. Adding to this the mention of Ithaca in later narratives, this seal is frequently cited in specialized works as an archaeological curiosity, opening the door to connections between the legendary figure of Odysseus and a possible local aristocrat who lived under the reign of the Wanax. However, it is essential to maintain a critical distance, as the epic tradition, written several centuries after the Mycenaean era, may have reinvented or amplified historical realities. It is therefore delicate to directly attribute this seal to an alleged prince of Ithaca without more explicit material or textual evidence. Despite these limitations, the imagination surrounding this small object illustrates how collective memory and archaeology can converge. The imprint of a seal provided at the time a tangible sign of authority or authenticity. When a seal was brandished on a clay tablet or a sealed contract, it symbolically materialized the word, commitment, or social rank of the bearer. Whether to validate land ownership, verify the quality of a jar of perfumed oil, or guarantee the origin of goods, these imprints circulated within the gears of an expanding bureaucracy. Today, in the light of accumulated knowledge, one can only acknowledge the narrative potential of each relic. The boar, a feared and honored animal, embodies the essence of the Mycenaean spirit, made of bravery and conquest. Sometimes associated with Odysseus and Ithaca, it further reveals how an archaeological detail can feed into a broader narrative, where history and legend are inextricably intertwined. When mentioning the Trojan War, it is almost impossible not to think of the Iliad, the great Greek epic traditionally attributed to the poet Homer. The plot of this text is set precisely around the end of the conflict, notably recounting the wrath of Achilles, a major hero among the Achaeans, a term that refers to the Greeks of the Mycenaean era, and describing the bloody assaults against the walls of Troy. Today, the Iliad is often considered the principal epic source on this event, even though its narrative occupies only a part of the supposed chronology of the war. Outside the Iliad, the Trojan cycle included several complementary poems, mostly lost today, such as the Cypria and the Ethiopies. The Cypria, sometimes called Kypria, recounted the chain of causes of the conflict, from the famous judgment of Paris, a young Trojan prince also called Alexander, to the arrival of the Achaean troops on the coast of Ilion, the other usual name for the city of Troy. The Ethiopis, on the other hand, focused on the continuation of the battles after Hector's death. The principal defender of the city, and evoked the intervention of heroes from Ethiopia, led by Memnon. These accounts, although only known through later summaries or rare citations, describe a heroic universe teeming with fabulous details, angry gods, and legendary warriors. Within this vast epic tradition, Odysseus, in Greek Odysseus, stands out for his intelligence and cunning, qualities that place him alongside Achilles and Agamemnon as a central character. In the Iliad, his initial role is that of a diplomat sent on an embassy to demand the return of Helen, wife of Menelaus, whom Paris allegedly abducted and took to Troy. In the absence of her restitution, the conflict erupts. Later, Odysseus's ingenuity remarkably shines in the episode of the wooden horse, which does not appear in the Iliad, but in the broader tradition of the Trojan cycle. The idea of the stratagem is traditionally credited to Odysseus. The plan involves constructing a gigantic hollow horse, leaving it ostensibly as an offering on the beach, then persuading the Trojans to bring it inside their walls. By night, a commando of Achaean warriors hidden inside the horse opens the gates of the city, sealing its fate. Among the cyclic poems, the Little Iliad and the Iliou Persis, literally the sack of Ilion, describe notably this final act, allowing an understanding of how Odysseus's ruse was credited with the final victory. This plurality of stories, which were orally transmitted in the archaic Greek tradition, sometimes makes it difficult to reconstruct a single chronological thread. Nevertheless, by cross-referencing the Iliad, the traces of the Cypria, and other songs, it seems that the ancient Greeks considered the Trojan War as a historical event that occurred around the 13th century BCE. On a purely literary level, Odysseus occupies a central position there, embodying metis, the intelligent cunning that complements Achilles' courage and Agamemnon's authority. Thus, the epic sources, despite their poetic embellishments, long served as the main compass for anyone wishing to shed light on the ins and outs of this mythical conflict. Although the Greek poems provide an Achaean view of the conflict, researchers discovered, from the late 19th century, and even more so during the 20th century, written testimonies in Anatolia on Hittite cuneiform tablets. The heart of the Hittite kingdom was located in the region corresponding to present-day central Turkey, and its capital, Hattusa, near the modern city of Boğaz-Calais, housed important royal archives. These documents mention conflicts and negotiations involving a territory named Wilusa, whose possible location would be the Troad, the coastal region where the site identified as the city of Troy is located. The Hittite archives also mention a country or people called Ahiawa, which many specialists associate with the Achaeans of Mycenaean Greece. One of the most revealing files concerns the Alexandru Treaty, a text written in the Hittite language stipulating an agreement between the king of the Hittites, probably Muwatalli II, or a neighboring sovereign in time, and a local ruler named Alexandru. The phonetic similarity between Alexandru and Alexandros, the other name for Paris, has intrigued historians for a long time. Although a direct link with the Trojan prince of legend is not proven, the coincidence is striking. Some argue that the treaty attests to the existence of a city-state or a local kingdom called Wilusa, led by a ruler whose identity recalls that of Paris. Others retort that the similarity of the name is not necessarily significant, since different Anatolian individuals could bear a similar name. Moreover, some Hittite documents report tensions between the Hittite kingdom and the Ahiawa regarding maritime checkpoints or border territories, sometimes mentioning military or diplomatic interventions to end conflicts. This geopolitical complexity corresponds to the image of an Eastern Mediterranean animated by commercial and maritime rivalries at the turn of the 13th century BCE. Thus, the Hittite texts, although they never explicitly mention the Trojan War as depicted in the Iliad, provide clues to a rivalry between a Western Anatolian power and a group of populations and princes that can easily be linked to the Mycenaeans. References to Wilusa and Ahiawa suggest the existence of a historical context likely to have fueled the Greek epic tradition. On the ground, the remains of ancient Troy are found at Hisarlik in the northwest of present-day Turkey by the Dardanelles. From the mid-19th century, the amateur archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann approached the site, championing the hypothesis that the visible ruins were indeed those of the city sung by Homer. Since then, excavations have continued over the decades under the guidance of various researchers, including Wilhelm Dörpfeld, Carl Blegen, and more recently, an international team. The results of these investigations have revealed several strata of occupation, identified under the names of Troy, Saurtsagant, 3, 4, V, 6, 7, etc., each corresponding to a distinct phase of urban or defensive activity. The period that has long drawn the attention of historians seeking a connection with the Homeric War is that of Troy VI and Troy VII. Archaeologists have proposed various subdivisions to refine the chronology. Troy Zakouch, for instance, corresponds to a phase marked by significant fortification works before an earthquake shook the region. Following this, Troy VII shows signs of destruction by fire and possible emergency reconfigurations, suggesting a siege or violent unrest, approximately dated between 1300 and 1190 BC. Radiocarbon 14C dating has validated the chronological coincidence between the end of Troy 70 and the supposed horizon of the Trojan War in Greek tradition, generally situated around 1250 BC or slightly later. On the material level, researchers have identified imported Mycenaean pottery, fragments of bronze weapons, and advanced defensive structures, which attest to commercial and political links with the Aegean world. Nevertheless, precise periodization remains the subject of debate. For instance, Troy VI, with its massive walls and impressive architectural wealth, might correspond to the great city described by Homer, but it seems to have suffered significant damage due to an earthquake rather than human conflict. The following layer, Troy VII, shows more signs of massive fire and population retreats within hastily redeveloped ramparts, which could align with the idea of a military siege. However, the excavations do not definitively confirm the existence of a single massive war as depicted in legend, and some destructions could relate to local skirmishes or repeated regional unrest. To better date these events, geoarchaeologists have conducted research on the surrounding sediments to reconstruct the coastline and ancient topography of the region. It appears that the plains around Troy were once occupied by marsh areas, and that direct maritime access to the city likely existed, which could explain the Homeric description of Achaean ships stationed close to the fortifications. These archaeological data, coupled with literary references, paint the picture of a strategically located city, likely to attract the covetousness of other powers, especially if it controlled the entry or exit of the Dardanelles, a major corridor between the Aegean Sea and the Sea of Marmara. In summary, the site of Hisarlik provides material evidence of a fortified city that experienced several periods of prosperity, turmoil, and reconstructions, which broadly aligns with the idea of a conflict, or possibly several conflicts, at the end of the Bronze Age. From these elements, modern historians strive to propose realistic scenarios of what might have happened around 1250 BC. First hypothesis: a commercial conflict opposing the rising power of the Mycenaean kingdoms, eager to extend their maritime routes and ensure the security of their trade to the city of Troy, strategically positioned as a key at the northwest of Anatolia. The Achaeans, Exporters of products such as perfumed oil, wine, metals, and other precious goods would have sought to guarantee free passage through the straits. If Troy levied a tribute or blocked certain flows, the tension could have degenerated into open war. Another avenue suggests a local succession war, where the kingdom of Troy was torn between several claimants, one of whom sought foreign aid. Hittite sources show that the small kingdoms or principalities of Anatolia regularly signed defensive and offensive alliances with the Hittite Empire or with other neighboring powers. The outbreak of violence that is suggested to have gripped the city of Troy could therefore fit within the framework of an internal conflict, amplified by the intervention of external allies, among whom we might identify the Achaeans described by the Hittite archives under the name Ahiawa. In this scenario, the episode of war would reduce to a series of sieges and targeted skirmishes against a backdrop of local dynastic quarrels. Some historians also envision a multiplication of regional conflicts rather than a single epic confrontation. The city of Troy, rich and fortified, could have been besieged multiple times, experiencing different forms of pressure, hence the layering of destruction evident in the archaeological levels. Over the course of reconstructions, myths may have intertwined, merging into a heroic narrative, nourished by oral tradition and enhanced by the bard or storyteller seeking to move their audience. In this process, centuries later, repeated struggles might have been reinterpreted as a single great episode of war, concentrated in time and placed under the banner of the greatest Greek heroes, Achilles, Odysseus, Ajax, Agamemnon, and many others, to create a founding narrative marking the emergence of Pan-Hellenic identity. Towards the end of the 13th century BCE, a crisis of unprecedented scope strikes the entire Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. This Bronze Age collapse, peaking between 1200 and 1050 BCE, is characterized by massive destruction, the abandonment of major urban centers, and the disappearance of several powers. The stable political horizon and cultural dynamism that distinguished the previous centuries are swept away in a few decades, leaving behind a fragmented landscape where the old empires can no longer maintain their cohesion. The exact causes of this collapse remain debated, but the consequences are dramatic. Burned cities, severed trade routes, and displaced populations proliferate throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Foremost among those blamed by Egyptian sources are the Sea Peoples. This term, used by the pharaonic scribes, encompasses various groups of invaders or migrants, sometimes warlike confederations of uncertain origin. The texts engraved in the Egyptian temples, notably on the wall of Pharaoh Ramses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu in the early 12th century BCE, describe these sea peoples as armed forces arriving by land and sea, pillaging the territories they traverse. Their names vary according to the inscriptions, but groups are often identified as Peliset, Shekelesh, Shurden, or Denyen. While they cannot all be located with certainty, it is likely that some of them originated from the Aegean or Anatolian regions, taking advantage of a crisis context to relocate. At the same time, the Hittite Empire, which dominated central Anatolia and exerted influence over large portions of the Levant, collapses spectacularly. Its capital, Hattusa, was once a fortified city with great walls, monumental temples, and cuneiform tablets preserved in enormous archives. But around 1200 BCE, the city is abruptly abandoned and gives way to an archaeological silence that indicates a clear rupture. No more traces of the central bureaucracy, no more organized imperial foundations, no more accumulated wealth like in prosperous times. Historians see this as a sign of a conjunction of possible factors: dynastic conflicts, agricultural climatic crises, external pressures, or even the disaffection of vassal regions, that simultaneously assail this imperial structure, too vast and too centralized to withstand multiple threats. The Sea Peoples may have contributed to this fall, but they are not necessarily the sole trigger. The Hittite Empire was already weakened by internal tensions and border rivalries. The city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, modern-day Ras Shamra in Syria, also illustrates the seriousness of the situation at this turning point. Ugarit was an active commercial hub, famous for its simplified Ugaritic cuneiform alphabet and maritime links with Cyprus, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Aegean Sea. However, around 1190 to 1185 BCE, the city is ravaged by a devastating fire. The tablets discovered in the ruins testify to a final correspondence between the local king and his allies. He was pleading for military aid that never came. The ruling class, administration, and population were unable to recover the city after this destruction. The archives abruptly end, signifying a total social collapse. As with Hattusa, the fate of Ugarit has long been attributed to a raid by the Sea Peoples, although other factors, conflicts with neighboring kingdoms, lack of resources, or potential earthquakes, may have contributed to this catastrophe. In the Aegean world, these disturbances are manifested by the collapse of the Mycenaean palaces. The political centers of Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Thebes show, through archaeological stratigraphy, signs of fires and abandonment between 1200 and 1150 BCE. These fortified palaces, which managed the supply of numerous vassal communities, previously concentrated agricultural and craft production, the redistribution of resources, and the coordination of trade expeditions to Italy, Anatolia, or Cyprus. The charred remains, crumbled walls, and broken or unfinished linear B tablets reveal a sudden crisis. Some sites, like Pylos, appear to have been stormed. Others experienced a more gradual decline without a unified authority taking control thereafter. The possible involvement of the Sea Peoples is not free from debate. Older historiographical currents favored the thesis of brutal invasions from abroad, while other perspectives suggest a chain of internal disorders, economic instability, and local revolts. Nonetheless, within a few decades, the brilliant Mycenaean civilization disappeared, leaving behind a cultural legacy that would only be partially transmitted to subsequent generations. Through this process of destruction and abandonment, the entire eastern Mediterranean basin experienced upheaval. The trade routes linking Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and the Aegean were interrupted or significantly reduced, exacerbating the shortage of strategic goods like metal or construction wood. The exchange of luxury products such as scented oil, quality textiles, and fine pottery became scarce, while the population struggled to survive by refocusing on subsistence agriculture and local support networks. This reorientation of economic priorities went hand in hand with political fragmentation. The centralized monarchy disintegrated in several regions, giving rise to new, more modest kingdoms or groups of independent villages. All this occurred in a climate of widespread insecurity, with fortifications multiplying, and where the notion of permanent defense, inherited from the Mycenaean palaces, became more vital than ever. Beyond the material destructions observed in the great capitals and princely centers, this period is also marked by significant migrations. Population movements, likely begun even before the crisis episodes, continued and intensified as imperial structures collapsed. Where a centralized organization once reigned, local powers no longer had the resources, nor often the legitimacy, to manage the inhabitants. The roads became uncertain, and exiles sought new places to settle, whether forced to flee or hoping to find better opportunities. When we talk of Achaeans, we generally refer to the Greek-speaking populations connected to the Mycenaean tradition, whose fundamental homeland was on the Greek mainland and in some Aegean islands. In the context of the collapse, Achaean groups migrated notably to Cyprus, an island already coveted for its copper riches and its strategic position at the crossroads of the Levant and Anatolia. Many archaeological remains, such as pottery decorated in the late Mycenaean style, attest to an increased Greek-speaking presence on the island after 1200 BCE. Archaeology highlights the emergence of new settlements, typical Mycenaean-style burials, and in some cases, funerary or cult practices influenced by Aegean culture. This progressive merging of local populations and new arrivals shaped Cypriot identity for centuries to come. Simultaneously, there is a flow back from the old Mycenaean centers to the Ionian Islands off the western coast of Greece. Islands like Leucas, Cephalonia, or Zakynthos might have sheltered part of the elite and warriors who had lost their palaces on the mainland. Although archaeological evidence remains scant in some places, a few coastal sites show a strengthening of the population and cultural continuity, suggesting the arrival of refugees or migrants of Mycenaean origin. This settlement could explain the persistence, in Greek oral tradition, of stories about fallen dynasties that supposedly re-established themselves in insular regions. The more isolated geographical setting of the islands perhaps offered them additional protection, far from a now unstable Peloponnese. Power vacuums left by the disappearance of the great monarchies have allowed the emergence of new entities, whether it be tribes in search of vulnerable territories or local leaders attempting to rebuild small independent kingdoms. In the northern Levant, former Hittite vassals took advantage of the collapse of Hattusa to establish themselves as autonomous principalities, sometimes sealing temporary alliances with equally weakened neighbors. In Egypt, after Ramses III's proclaimed victory over the Sea Peoples around 1176 BC, pharaonic power tried to reassert its authority, but remained in a state of constant tension, having to face new internal threats, economic difficulties, intrigues within the court, external abuses by nomadic populations, unrest in Syria-Palestine. Moreover, the displacement of groups once subject to the Hittites or Mycenaeans may explain the spread of techniques or artistic styles. For example, elements of Mycenaean art appear in residual form in Anatolia, Cyprus, and on the Syrian coast without there necessarily being a massive influx of Greeks. Similarly, artisans or scribes trained in the Hittite Empire may have put their skills to use in new kingdoms or independent lordships, maintaining the tradition of cuneiform writing to some extent. But overall, literacy declined in several regions due to the lack of powerful administrative centers to support it, and written diplomatic exchanges became rarer. This recomposition of the human landscape opened the way to a darker period, where the memory of past exploits was mainly preserved orally, and where large monumental constructions were no longer in vogue. The dismantling of trade networks, particularly that of metals, plunged some populations into an age of technical withdrawal. Bronze, so crucial for the manufacture of weapons and tools, became more difficult to obtain, and there was a gradual shift towards iron, more accessible locally. However, this change in material fully endorsed over the following centuries required the adaptation of forges and metallurgy techniques. Migrations, by worsening the dislocation of traditional markets, further hastened the end of the Bronze Age and the transition to the Iron Age. In this context of upheaval, the sharing and transmission of knowledge became major issues for communities seeking to preserve their identity and history. The old bureaucracies, whether Mycenaean scribes handling linear B or Hittite officials using cuneiform, vanished with the fall of palaces and capitals. When archive deposits burned and institutions disappeared, written traditions quickly dwindled for lack of infrastructures capable of maintaining and teaching, reading and writing. Thus, the place of orality, already very important in those societies, was considerably strengthened. The bards' Eads, these itinerant poet-singers, then became the main vectors of collective memory. Through their narratives, they perpetuate the stories of legendary heroes and great kings whose palaces are now in ruins. These songs, chanted or accompanied by string instruments, undoubtedly followed narrative patterns and poetic formulas stemming from a tradition several centuries old. In the case of Greece, the Aedes are later described as the guardians of an epic treasure, where figures associated with the mythology of Homer, such as Agamemnon, Menelaus, Achilles, or Ulysses, appear. While many of these names could refer to real lineages or historical figures, the line between reality and legendary embellishment became increasingly blurred when the official pen of the administration no longer existed to record events. These bards, singing from court to court and from town to town, serve to transmit common values, emphasize the importance of bravery in battle, cunning in adversity, and solidarity in troubled times. The epic formulas represent an essential technical aspect. They constitute ready-made expressions, common in several Indo-European languages, that facilitate memorization and allow the singer to improvise by relying on a lexical and narrative heritage. For example, the invocation of a hero can be regularly associated with a fixed epithet, whether it is swift-footed Achilles or wily Odysseus. This ritual process, the result of long elaboration, allows the essence of the story to be preserved through the vagaries of time and travel. Moreover, the social role of the epic tale goes far beyond entertainment. In a period when political structures have collapsed, the epic becomes a means of building or maintaining a certain identity cohesion. The sung exploits establish a link with an ideal or glorious past when palaces reigned and commerce flourished. For scattered communities, these stories provide a common language, a collective imagination, from which to draw the pride and solidarity necessary for reconstruction. The stories of epic sieges, perilous sea voyages, or exiled princes finding refuge on an island poetically recall the harsh reality experienced by so many populations at the time of the collapse of great kingdoms. In the Levant, comparable oral traditions likely played a similar role, although written documentation postdating the Bronze Age is less preserved in this region. Fragments of Canaanite epic tales can be glimpsed in certain legends, later transmitted in the Hebrew Bible or Phoenician literature. The bards of the Levant may have taken up some great Hittite or Ugaritic myths, adapting them to a new political configuration where city-states attempt to rise from their ashes. The absence of a prestigious center like Ugarit to archive these songs explains why it is today difficult to trace their historical trajectory, as precisely as that of Greek epics. Across the vast Mediterranean space during this period of crisis, oral tradition brings together communities often distinct by language or culture. Since we no longer have an extensive written corpus, the remnants of pottery or weapons can only indicate population flows. The stories, however, circulate with much more freedom. They transcend boundaries and are nourished by multiple influences, evoking vanished kings, mythified heroes, or military campaigns in distant territories. Gradually, common themes emerge: the loss of a homeland, the quest for a home, the tragic fate of palaces fallen into ruin. Between the collapse of the Mycenaean world around 1200 BC and the emergence of archaic civilization around 750 BC, Greece goes through a period often referred to as the Dark Ages. This term highlights the eclipse of great palaces, sophisticated trade networks, and writing, as well as the scarcity or disappearance of certain archaeological sources. During these centuries, the major political centers of the Bronze Age are no longer active. They give way to small rural communities, scattered across a territory whose population has significantly decreased. Despite this seemingly austere context, these same Dark Ages actually prepare the Renaissance of Greek culture. The use of iron becomes dominant, new artistic styles emerge, and most importantly, oral traditions develop, laying the foundations for future Homeric epics. By around 1050 BC, many Mycenaean city palaces have already been abandoned or destroyed. The surviving populations then retreat to smaller localities, sometimes isolated villages, where a new type of leader, the basileus, takes root. This term, later rendered as king, actually refers, in these early times, to a local leader capable of directing a relatively small community, rather than an extensive territory or an established kingdom. The basileus is often a recognized warrior, an arbiter of conflicts, and a protector of the cult. His power does not have the scope or complexity of that of the Mycenaean wanax, the equivalent of great king in the linear B tablets. But he nevertheless bases his legitimacy on honor and reputation, elements at the heart of emerging aristocratic society. The social structure, simpler than in the previous era, relies on kinship groups and military alliances. Within these villages, the housing changes, with large palatial constructions marked by corridors and reception halls with elaborate frescoes giving way to more modest houses, often built from perishable materials like wood and wattle and daub. The population density decreases significantly, especially in the Peloponnese and Boeotia, two regions once dominated by imposing Mycenaean complexes. However, there is a gradual maintenance of regional centers, such as Lefkandi on the island of Euboea, which experiences notable development at the beginning of these dark centuries. Artistically and archaeologically, the emergence of so-called proto-geometric pottery is observed from the 11th century BC, followed by geometric pottery starting approximately from the 10th to 9th century. This term originates from the predominance of motifs composed of straight lines, concentric circles, and angular figures decorating the vases. These decorations gradually replace the more naturalistic styles of the Mycenaean period. Potters adopt a range of repetitive and stylized signs, meanders, grids, triangles, and zigzags. Often, geometric pottery achieves a high level of elegance. It reflects the progressive revival of a common aesthetic across different regions of the Aegean. Simultaneously, changes in burial practices are notable. We see a reduction in burials in monumental tholos tombs in favor of more modest tombs, and, increasingly, a recourse to cremation. This evolution reveals a change in mentalities, and perhaps also in economic means. The establishment of a fairly uniform system of cremation in certain regions, particularly in Athens and Euboea, suggests a shift towards new conceptions of the relationship with the dead and collective memory. Tombs sometimes contain personal objects, such as iron weapons or simple jewelry, indicating that the use of iron is being established as the new standard to the detriment of the former bronze. While the use of iron is partly related to the collapse of metal supply networks, especially tin, essential for making bronze, it also represents a technological turning point. Malleable when hot and more abundant in certain regions, iron offers increased possibilities for crafting weapons and tools. From the 10th century BC, this metal increasingly equips warriors and farmers. The improvement in forging techniques allows the rise of self-sufficient communities, less dependent on long trade routes. This return to a local economy partly explains why the Dark Centuries are poorly documented by archaeology, producing fewer sumptuous objects and mainly meeting daily needs. In this rural and fragmented context, the figure of the basileus strengthens symbolically. Communities gather around charismatic leaders endowed with martial prestige inherited from Mycenaean heroic ideology. The recounting of past exploits, preserved orally, reinforces the legitimacy of these leaders. The heroes of yore are sung about, and current leaders draw part of their value from this tradition. This alliance between memorial continuity and adaptation to new living conditions imperceptibly prepares the resurgence of a written culture and a more firmly anchored Greek identity. During the Dark Centuries, Greece no longer possesses a functional writing system. The linear B tablets, typical of Mycenaean palatial administration, vanished with the collapse of the Mycenaean world. However, far from plunging the culture into total hibernation, this era contributes to the rise of oral tradition. The Aids, itinerant poet-singers, convey legendary tales that are passed down from generation to generation. Among these traditions, we find the earliest songs of Ulysses, oral ancestors of what will become the Odyssey. The central theme of these stories, called nostos in Greek, refers to the hero's return to his homeland after long tribulations. The character of Ulysses, presumed king of Ithaca, already stands out for his ingenuity and cunning, a quality that the Greeks call metis. He is described as the man of many wiles, who triumphs not only by force, but by the art of persuasion and craftiness. This motif of the clever hero echoes other Indo-European traditions. He can be compared to certain trickster figures found in Indian epics or stories, such as the Vidushaka, who is sometimes depicted as a sly jester or clown evolving in Sanskrit texts. Although the two characters do not operate in the same cultural framework, literary parallels can be noted of the clever-tongued hero capable of setting a trap or thwarting that of the enemy, referring to a universal archetype of the crafty traveler. The songs are shaped around oral turns of phrase and repetitive formulas that facilitate memorization. The bards, endowed with a particular talent for improvisation and mnemonics, recite epic excerpts, sometimes adding variations according to the audience and events. The length of these tales can be considerable, as orality tolerates additions, ellipses, and adaptive digressions. Thus, each performance constitutes both the preservation and the creation of a tradition. Ulysses' adventures, braving monsters and storms, feed over the ages on recurring themes. The trial of the journey, the temptation of oblivion embodied in the myth of the lotus, the confrontation with supernatural creatures like the Cyclops and Sirens, and finally, the return to the family home. Beyond the mere description of adventures, the songs of Ulysses offer the model of a wandering hero, capable of overcoming challenges by his intellect. Communities deprived of strong political structures in these dark ages may find a form of moral encouragement. As Ulysses, they must show ingenuity and resilience to survive in a world more hostile and uncertain than during the times of great palaces. The stories of the Nostos type then serve as a mirror to the realities of small Greek villages, sometimes forced to migrate or adapt to new territories. The figure of Ulysses already functions as a receptacle of universal experiences: courage, cunning, uprootedness, and hope for return. Moreover, some clues suggest that contacts with the Levant or Anatolia may have nourished the material of these tales. Migration and maritime trade, though reduced compared to the Mycenaean era, do not come to a complete halt. Oriental objects, amulets, or artistic motifs sporadically appear in certain tombs or coastal sites, evidencing tenuous yet persistent links. These exchanges, whether commercial or cultural, may have contributed to the richness of the epic imagination, where Aegean, Semitic, and possibly even more distant influences intermingle. In any case, the oral performances establish the myth of Ulysses as one of the pillars of collective memory, alongside Achilles or Agamemnon, other heroes of the Trojan epic. It is in this orality of the Dark Ages that the foundations of the Homeric cycle, including the Iliad and the Odyssey, take shape. While it is probable that true epic songs were sung about many heroes, Ulysses captures the Greek imagination through the richness of his character. Far from being a mere warrior, he embodies the subtlety necessary for survival in a world with limited resources and multiple dangers. It is toward the end of these dark ages, between the 9th and the middle of the 8th century BC, that Greece adopts and adapts the Phoenician alphabet. The Phoenicians, originating from the coastal strip corresponding roughly to modern-day Lebanon, already possessed an alphabetic writing system since the 2nd millennium BC. Based on 22 consonantal signs, it initially did not include letters for vowels, as the Semitic language allowed for their omission in writing. When Phoenician navigators, artisans, and merchants came into contact with Greek populations, the cultural impact was not limited to luxury goods or maritime techniques. It extended to the writing system. The specificity of Greek genius is revealed in the adaptation they make to note their own language. The Greeks modify several Phoenician letters and create symbols designed to represent vowels. This is how the first truly complete alphabet is born, where consonants and vowels coexist, to translate a great diversity of phonemes. This linguistic contribution is often associated with a period of regional effervescence, marked by the gradual restart of maritime exchanges and the emergence of new urban centers. Coastal sites, in particular, play a crucial role in the diffusion of these innovations. This transition from oral to written coincides with the establishment of more structured and stable political forms than those dominated by mere village basileis. Thanks to the alphabet, it becomes possible to record the rules of the nascent city, establish commercial agreements, or treaties with regional scope. The Greek elites, attracted by the idea of leaving a more durable trace than simple oral tradition, quickly seize this new form of writing. Inscriptions start to be engraved on stones, pottery, or offerings, thus leaving tangible testimonies of human activity. Regarding the Homeric songs, the adoption of the Phoenician alphabet profoundly changes the destiny of oral narratives. Until then, perpetuated by the memory of the bards, these epics are gradually set down in writing. This new way of fixing oral speech into text reduces the risk of forgetting or uncontrolled transformations over generations. The very first noted hexameters, the traditional verse form for epic poetry, probably date from the second half of the 8th century BC, even if direct traces are rare. It is likely that the initiative to write the epics stemmed from collective work, driven by the emerging courts of cities ready to promote their own literary and identity heritage. The written fixation gradually gives birth to a coherent corpus, the Iliad and the Odyssey being the masterpieces of what will later be called the Homeric cycle. In the Odyssey, the character of Odysseus then acquires increased depth and narrative coherence. His adventures, his exchanges with the gods, his emotions, and his cunning follow one another with a certain continuity that reflects the desire to compile and formalize songs of multiple origins. This transition from orality to text also explains certain repetitions of formulas or epithets, characteristic of a composition originally sung over the course of banquets. However, the written form allows for a more organized architecture of the epic and highlights the symbolic links uniting the different adventures. The Phoenician alphabet is thus not only a practical tool, it is a cornerstone of cultural revival. It offers the possibility of enduringly transmitting the memory of the past, codifying civic life, and developing an unprecedented intellectual reflection. With the mastery of the new writing system, Greek populations propel their civilization to a decisive stage. They prepare for the forthcoming bloom of literature, philosophy, and historiography. In this movement, Odysseus, whose exploits were previously reconstructed by the voices of a few bards, acts as a form of textual immortality, calling on future generations to read, interpret, and possibly question him. Around the middle of the 8th century BC, in the coastal region of Ionia, located on the western facade of Anatolia in present-day Turkey, a particular cultural ferment emerges. This area, consisting of autonomous Greek cities like Miletus, Ephesus, and Chios, then benefits from a strategic position between the Aegean world and the land routes of Asia Minor. It is at this time, approximately between 750 and 700 BC, that the tradition of Greece's most famous epic poems crystallizes, the Iliad and the Odyssey, attributed to a legendary bard named Homer. For an international audience today situated millennia apart, it is essential to understand that this moment of intellectual and artistic effervescence takes place in a context where maritime exchanges and political rivalries intermingle. The Ionian cities, already renowned for their commercial dynamism, then gather a wide range of knowledge, myths, and oral narratives transmitted by professional singers. At the heart of this tradition stands the figure of Homer, a poet whose very existence remains subject to question. The name of Homer has resonated since antiquity as that of the quintessential poet, yet his actual biography remains shrouded in mystery. Numerous Greek cities, including Smyrna and Argos, have claimed the privilege of being his homeland. However, it is the island of Chios in the Aegean Sea that has most fiercely preserved the memory of this bard. There, a fraternity or guild of singers, called the Homeridae, claim to be either the descendants or at least the custodians of the Homeric legacy. Some ancient authors believe that these Homeridae passed down from generation to generation the entirety of the poems attributed to Homer, while inserting variants or additions according to the regions and eras. This oral tradition was primarily exercised during festivals, civic celebrations, and aristocratic banquets, where the audience would listen to long narrative songs celebrating the exploits of heroes of the past. The figure of Homer, often imagined as an old blind poet, thus symbolized the collective memory of the Greeks, unifying communities around common narratives. However, it is quite possible, according to some modern researchers, that Homer was not a single person, but the synthesis of several generations of bards who gradually combined entire segments of popular tradition. To explain the internal variations, the repetitive formulas, and the sometimes different styles between the Iliad and the Odyssey, historians and philologists have proposed the theory of multiple bards. According to this hypothesis, several itinerant poets would have contributed to the progressive development of a vast epic corpus before one or more of them proceeded to the final assembly. The Greeks of antiquity were aware of the oral dimension of their memory. Before alphabetic writing truly took hold, stories were sung and transmitted from person to person. Poetic performances, accompanied by the forminx, a string instrument, relied on repetitive formulas and typical epithets, like swift-footed for Achilles or of many wiles for Odysseus, to facilitate memorization. Whether Homer was an individual or a generic name covering several bards, the fact is that the Iliad and the Odyssey achieved such coherence that they quickly became foundational texts of Greek identity. Thus, in the era of archaic Ionia, the essential question was not so much who exactly had originally created these epics, but rather how they reflected the values, beliefs, and maritime and heroic experiences of the Aegean world. The period of the 8th century BC is also characterized by intense circulation of goods and ideas around the Mediterranean basin. The Ionian cities, accessible thanks to good natural harbors and an expanding network of maritime routes, played a pivotal role as a crossroads between mainland Greece, the eastern regions of Phoenicia, Cyprus, the Levant, and, to a lesser extent, Egypt. This mosaic of influences explains why the Iliad and the Odyssey feature a pan-Greco-Levantine geographic palette, incorporating references to multiple lands. The Iliad primarily focuses on the Trojan War, on the Anatolian coast, while the Odyssey draws on navigation traditions largely inspired by the legends of Phoenician or Cretan sailors. When the singers compiled these materials, they layered onto deeply Mycenaean wartime narratives inherited from the Bronze Age various elements from neighboring cultures. For example, some descriptions of ships or maritime routes seem to reflect the nautical knowledge of the 8th century rather than that of the 13th century BC. The geographic expanse covered by the epic reinforces its universal character in the eyes of the Greeks, who see themselves in a unifying narrative anchored both in their heroic past and in the reality of their expansion in the eastern Mediterranean. One of the major characteristics of these two epics lies in their literary structure, often referred to as ring composition. This technique involves opening a narrative episode with a theme or scene, gradually moving away from it through secondary developments, and then returning to it at the end of the sequence, creating a symmetry effect. This form aims both to facilitate memorization for the bard and to captivate the audience with a sense of closure. Furthermore, the Iliad and the Odyssey extensively use the technique of embedded narratives, in which a character recounts an anecdote woven into the main plot. The confrontation between various viewpoints, the insertion of direct speeches, the variation between battle scenes, descriptions of banquets, and moments of divine counsel give these texts an exceptional dramatic richness for the time. Although this was an oral tradition, the vast overall coherence of these two epic poems demonstrates a refined mastery of storytelling. In the Iliad, Achilles' wrath serves as the guiding theme, while in the Odyssey, Ulysses' return is the driving force. Thus, even without the undeniable signature of a single author, the Iliad and the Odyssey reveal an architecture designed to leave a lasting mark on minds. Despite their antiquity and their belonging to the epic genre, the Iliad and the Odyssey conceal a wealth of concrete information about the lifestyle and nautical knowledge of Greek populations. In the Odyssey, for example, Ulysses sails from port to port, using celestial landmarks like the Great Bear, according to certain passages, and observing the direction of the winds to navigate. The Ionian navigators of the 8th century BC already knew some empirical rules that allowed them to follow the coasts without getting lost at sea. The prevailing winds of the Aegean Sea, such as the meltem, are evoked through poetic terms that show a keen awareness of seasonal weather conditions. Ocean currents could prove dangerous, forcing crews to reach the shores or use oars when the wind was lacking. The epithets applied to ships, hollow vessels, demonstrate attention to the construction of boats capable of withstanding the longest journeys. There are also allusions to stopovers to replenish food supplies and offer sacrifices to protective deities, all of which reflect practices that, for modern international audiences show that the Homeric adventure is based on a rather realistic backdrop. These concrete notations, however, coexist with clearly supernatural elements, illustrated by the presence of one-eyed giants. The Cyclops, sorceresses like Circe, shapeshifters like Proteus, or Sirens enchanting sailors with the sweetness of their songs. These fantastic figures are rooted in a long tradition of folktales, but they also serve as metaphors to depict the danger and allure of unknown lands. In the Odyssey, Ulysses must confront the Cyclops Polyphemus, the embodiment of brute force devoid of laws, or resist the call of the Sirens, capable of hypnotizing the crew and leading them to their deaths. To the archaic Greeks, the sea remained a universe rife with traps, inhabited by poorly controlled divine entities. The inclusion of such monsters lent an initiatory dimension to the voyages. The listeners could feel the full power of nature and the unknown. Moreover, these episodes provide a dramatic means to illustrate Ulysses' cunning and perseverance, a hero famous for his metis, that is, cunning, resourcefulness, or ability to innovate in dangerous situations. This back and forth between realistic aspects and legendary elements characterizes Greek epic literature. For the Ionian audience of the time, the boundary was not clearly established between concrete history and foundational myth. The gods intervene directly in human actions, whether it is Athena protecting Odysseus or Poseidon unleashing the sea. However, the presence of credible details about navigation or geography suggests that the poet relies on actual observations. Thus, an 8th century audience could recognize familiar landscapes while accepting the intrusion of the supernatural as an integral part of the narrative. Today, this tension sparks scholarly debates about how Homer, or the Homeric tradition, incorporated cosmographic, meteorological, and ethnographic data. Some see this as proof that a genius bard painstakingly assembled disparate tales. Others, on the contrary, emphasize the flexibility of the oral tradition, capable of absorbing any new anecdote to weave it into a larger narrative at the cost of ingenious narrative rearrangements. Among the attempts to anchor the Odyssey in a more precise chronology is the episode reported in Book XX, where Odysseus, returned to Ithaca, observes various celestial omens announcing the imminent vengeance against the suitors. Several passages describe unusual astronomical phenomena, sometimes associated with a solar eclipse. At least, this is what some exegetes since antiquity have thought they detected in the text, suggesting that Homer might have slipped in an allusion to a significant celestial event. In the 20th century, experts in astronomy and philology made efforts to identify a real eclipse corresponding to the hypothetical date of Odysseus's return. One of the most famous hypotheses was published in the 1920s, proposing an eclipse that occurred in 1178 BC. Other researchers have suggested other dates, notably 1312 or 1143 BC. However, the precision of the text remains too vague for scholars to agree on a certain astronomical alignment. Proponents of a literal interpretation of Book XX insist that expressions like the sun is extinguished in the sky or darkness falls at noon closely resemble the phenomenon of a total solar eclipse. Moreover, they argue that the mention of other omens, such as blood dripping from the walls or the delirious vision of specters, might correspond to the drama a bard would introduce to signify a terrifying celestial event to the audience. Conversely, skeptics point out that Homer regularly integrates metaphors of darkness when an impending disaster is approaching, whether it is a battle or the death of a hero. Therefore, nothing requires considering the passage as a scientific description of a real eclipse. Furthermore, astronomical dating based on an approximate text subject to successive interpolations remains extremely hazardous. Calculations do show several possible eclipses during the transition between the Bronze Age and the Archaic period, but no indisputable evidence allows us to identify one particular year with certainty. Thus, book texting of the Odyssey still fuels today a fascinating debate among philologists, historians, and astronomers. Whether there is an astronomical basis in this scene or not, the eclipse anecdote illustrates the quasi-historical dimension some have wanted to associate with the Homeric poems. As early as the Hellenistic period, Alexandrian scholars sought to align epic chronology with calculable data to establish the reputation of Homer as an omniscient poet anchored in concrete reality. Over the centuries, this episode has regularly resurfaced under the pen of commentators seeking to untangle the part of truth and the part of fiction in Homer. For an international contemporary audience, it offers a convincing example of how a so-called mythical narrative can, under certain conditions, be perceived as bearing precise, factual details. This attempt at dating also testifies to the recurring desire to confer a date, a place, and a tangible context to a hero and a bard who have, for the most part, forged their immortality through the collective imagination. Thus, the question of the eclipse reminds us that Homer's work is one of the permanent points of contact between reality, symbol, and the construction of cultural identity. By placing Homer in the Ionian context of the 8th century BC, we better understand the magnitude of the epic heritage that shaped ancient Greece. Migrations, colonization, the rise of maritime trade, and the birth of a common identity allowed these epics to take root in all the poleis of Hellenic culture and beyond. The interaction between the poetic register and daily life is revealed in every scene of hospitality, every banquet, every negotiation between chiefs, every naval adventure. The realistic elements nourish the plausibility, while the wonderful aspects provide fertile ground for reflection on nature, destiny, and the hero's ethics. All this, carried by Homer's reputation, gave the Greeks a basis for explaining their semi-legendary past, unifying the stories of previous generations. For an international audience, it is important to grasp how these epic poems guided the historical consciousness of the Greeks, much like they shaped Western literature for over 2 millennia. In the centuries that followed, the Ionian cities continued to be perceived as the cradle of this epic tradition and the birthplace of Greek literature. Philosophers like Thales and Anaximander, originating from Miletus, expanded the questioning to the nature of the cosmos, paving the way for the emergence of rational science. Meanwhile, the rhapsodes, those professionals of recitation, became the guardians of Homer's word, tirelessly repeating the verses of the Iliad and the Odyssey at poetic contests. Disputes about Homeric authenticity, the original length of the poems, or the identification of passages deemed late, have never really ceased. Commentators of the 5th century BC already recorded criticisms, while Athens, Sparta, and other cities adopted the Iliad as a moral and educational text. This continuity explains why, in European intellectual history, Ionia is often described as a raw material of Western civilization, where the Homeric song was refined, where it acquired its quasi-institutional dimension, and where the idea of poetry, capable of transcending time, took root. During the period from about 700 to 300 BC, the island of Ithaca, located in the Ionian Sea, west of mainland Greece, became a subject of puzzles and controversies among ancient scholars. These debates, already mentioned by classical authors, mainly concern the exact location of the legendary homeland of Odysseus, the hero of Homer's Odyssey. For a contemporary audience, it can be difficult to imagine how much the Greeks of that time were already seeking to verify the correspondence between epic descriptions and the geographical realities accessible to them. Discussions focus on the topography, visible archaeological sites, and the feasibility of a precise identification between the land sung in the Homeric poems and the actual landscape. Two places particularly attract attention: the modern island of Ithaca and the Peliki Peninsula of Cephalonia. This controversy has fueled, to this day, the quest for definitive proof. The first geographical option, supported since antiquity, is simply to consider that the Homeric Ithaca corresponds to the island we today call Ithaca. This island, with an area of approximately 90 square kilometers, contains several sites associated with local traditions, linking the Homeric narrative to concrete remains. To the north, near the village of Stavros, some excavations conducted from the early 20th century uncovered pottery fragments and structures that, according to some archaeologists, could belong to an ancient palace. There is also the Itos Peninsula, forming a narrow isthmus, where traces of fortifications and ruins of ancient buildings are visible. Furthermore, the famous Cave of the Nymphs has long been proposed as the place where, according to the Odyssey, Odysseus hid his treasures upon his return. This traditional location has the merit of simplicity, but several disagreements persist. The second hypothesis, which appeared later, considers that the true Ithaca is actually located on the large island of Cephalonia, particularly in the Peliki region to the west. According to this theory, a channel now filled with sediments would have separated Peliki from the rest of Cephalonia in antiquity, forming a distinct island. Various geomorphologists are attempting to reconstruct the evolution of the terrain by studying layers of deposits and soil configuration. Some suggest that the regular earthquakes in the area, combined with natural erosion, could have altered the topography to the point of erasing this maritime separation. Other researchers, relying on Homer's poetic descriptions, believe that the landscape described in the Odyssey would correspond more closely to the current Peliki. This hypothesis, though still controversial, fuels many studies on the region's geology, especially to determine the extent of coastal changes since antiquity. It offers a new perspective on the identity of Ithaca. In addition to these land-based investigations, underwater research plays a crucial role in the quest for the true Ithaca. For several decades, teams of divers and maritime archaeologists have been exploring the coasts of Cephalonia and Ithaca to identify potential submerged ancient ports. One of the most intriguing sites is located near Fiscardo, at the northern end of Cephalonia. There, under a few meters of water, lie masonry structures and fragments of amphorae, attesting to ancient port activity. Specialists wonder if this port could have belonged to a distinct political entity, in line with the idea that Peliki was once separated from the rest of the island. The evidence gathered to date suggests active commerce from the classical period, or even earlier. However, the variable state of conservation and the challenges of underwater excavation make interpretation delicate. The next surveying campaigns could provide decisive clues about ancient port configurations, a mystery. Written sources from the period 700 to 300 BCE also mention the existence of Ithaca, though they do not always provide the clarity one might hope for. Thucydides, historian of the Peloponnesian War in the 5th century BCE, mentions the island in his geographical digressions, while admitting the difficulty of confirming the exact position described by Homer. Strabo, A geographer active around the beginning of the 1st century BCE revisits the question by relying on earlier accounts, but notes the confusion that reigns among scholars. According to him, the discrepancies stem either from transcription errors or from a natural evolution of the coastline that would have rendered some features described by the poet unrecognizable. These testimonies highlight that despite Odysseus's notoriety in Greek culture, identifying his natal kingdom remained problematic for the ancients. The landscape could transform over the centuries, heightening the doubt among travelers and historians. Excavations conducted at the site of Stavros multiplied in the second half of the 20th century, particularly under the aegis of Greek and foreign archaeologists, seeking to better understand the occupation of the island during the Iron Age and the Classical era. Beyond the pottery and foundation walls discovered, a few fragments of inscriptions in archaic Greek alphabet testify to a dynamic cultural life. The heads of the archaeological missions emphasize, however, that no irrefutable proof has yet shown that this was a palace in the Homeric sense, meaning a major political and economic center. The remains rather indicate a defensive installation or a noble establishment of intermediate importance. This distinction is crucial because it reinforces the idea that Ithaca could have retained a semi-autonomous status during the Classical era while maintaining commercial and diplomatic ties with neighboring cities. Debates, however, persist. Not far from Stavros, the so-called Cave of the Nymphs also sparks interest. 19th century travelers, fascinated by the possibility of treading the same grounds as Ulysses, saw it as the cavern described in the Odyssey. The stalactites and stalagmites, along with the presence of a freshwater spring, matched what they believed were Homeric clues, where offerings and treasures might have been hidden. In the first half of the 20th century, surveys revealed ceramic fragments dating back to the Classical period without the possibility of confirming a specific cult use. Some see it as a sanctuary dedicated to the nymphs, minor deities of waters and woods, while others perceive it merely as a natural shelter used occasionally. In any case, the site remains a powerful symbol, connecting epic memory to tangible archaeological relics. On the side of the Peliki Peninsula, supporters of the theory of an ancient separation of Cephalonia rely on seismology and stratigraphy studies. Geological surveys show intense tectonic activity in the region, with major earthquakes recorded over the centuries. The sediment layers, particularly where the Old Strait is supposed to have existed, sometimes reveal marine deposits mixed with continental alluvium, suggesting a vanished coastal landscape. Additionally, carbon-14 dating measures on buried wood could more precisely illuminate the timeline of this burial. Proponents of this model emphasize that such natural transformations are not rare in Greece, with comparable historical cases. However, definitive proof is yet to emerge. New studies might soon fill this documentary void. The area of Fiscardo continues to captivate the imagination, as the submerged port offers clues to the economic prosperity of Cephalonia during antiquity. Ancient shipwrecks lying nearby, laden with wine amphorae, testify to the extent of commercial networks between mainland Greece and southern Italy. Some researchers suggest linking these findings to maritime traditions evoked by Homer, making this area a transit point for Achaean ships. Nevertheless, caution is warranted. Locating an ancient port does not prove that it was the heart of Ithaca. At this stage, underwater research refines our understanding of the region's harbor life, but provides no irrefutable evidence regarding Ulysses' kingdom. More precise sediment analyses could help reconstruct the original coastline and clarify ancient toponymy. Ulysses, as an emblematic figure constantly reinterpreted, garners keen interest among thinkers and artists of classical Greece, particularly in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. During these 2 centuries, which correspond to Athens' Golden Age and the troubled era of the Peloponnesian War, the mythical character from the Odyssey continues to hold a prominent place in the Greek collective imagination. Philosophers, especially the Sophists and Plato, seize upon Ulysses' example to explore moral, political, and intellectual notions, while tragedians like Sophocles and Euripides draw from his adventures to enrich drama and question human nature. Simultaneously, Attic iconography, especially vase painting, demonstrates a continuous enthusiasm for the hero's adventures, with the Trojan horse episode remaining an iconic symbol. Finally, an anecdotal but telling fact about the political uses of his name is found in an election ostracon, an object that well reveals the referential reach of the character in the civic daily life of Athenians. This section aims to shed light on the status Ulysses holds in the intellectual and artistic landscape of classical Greece, highlighting the different prisms through which the hero's figure is then analyzed, celebrated, or critiqued. The classical period is marked by the rise of Greek philosophy, and, in particular, by the emergence of what has been called the sophistic movement. The sophists, in the 5th century BC, define themselves as masters of wisdom, or specialists in discourse. Among them are itinerant teachers like Protagoras, Gorgias, and Hippias, who offer an education essentially based on rhetoric, the art of persuasion, and on the relativity of opinions. For these thinkers, gaining the audience's adhesion relies above all on métis, a Greek concept often translated as cunning or mental agility. Odysseus happens to be the literary embodiment par excellence of métis, both for his ability to devise ingenious stratagems and for his keen sense of adaptation. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, he proves himself to be a skillful orator, capable of both convincing and deceiving. This talent allows him to manipulate situations and survive seemingly insurmountable obstacles, from the Cyclops Polyphemus to the temptation of Calypso. In the eyes of the Sophists, the figure of Odysseus vividly illustrates the idea that with oratorical talent, mental flexibility, and a certain boldness, one can alter the course of events to one's advantage. In their teachings, the Sophists can therefore praise Odysseus as a model of intelligence in action. This hero is not just brave and courageous, he is above all a virtuoso of speech and legitimate deception. According to Gorgias, nothing resists a well-constructed discourse. Similarly, Odysseus always finds a way to tip the scales in his favor, even when brute strength is lacking. The example of the Trojan horse, attributed to the hero's ingenuity, then becomes an almost advertising argument in favor of sophistic rhetoric, highlighting the demonstration that an ingenious idea can prevail over the most imposing force. Moreover, the Odyssey of Odysseus, marked by a long return to Ithaca, punctuated by multiple trials, appears as a metaphor for human existence, in which each person must use cunning and prudence to achieve their ends. Thus, Odysseus becomes, in the eyes of these masters of discourse, an exemplary literary reference, an archetype of the man capable of triumphing through speech. In the Greek cities where eloquence in the assembly or in court is a fundamental asset, the lesson is all the more applicable. Manipulating language with virtuosity is to acquire a power over reality. However, the celebration of cunning and trickery in Odysseus is not unanimous. Plato, philosopher of the next generation in the 4th century BC, does not feel the same fascination for métis when it transforms into lies or deceit disrespectful of truth. In several of his dialogues, Plato openly criticizes sophistic relativism and condemns rhetoric when it serves falsehood. For him, virtue lies in the sincere pursuit of the good and the true, not in cunning or flattery, capable of manipulating opinion. Yet Odysseus, who often resorts to lies to achieve his goals, symbolizes an ambiguous archetype. On one hand, he is a hero celebrated by epic tradition. On the other, he embodies the ingenious deceiver who does not hesitate to invent multiple identities to obtain what he seeks. In certain critical evocations, Plato implies that such indiscriminate use of deceit, even if it sometimes serves a good purpose, the Greek victory at Troy or the protection of his companions from mortal dangers, is not the action of a truly just man. However, one should not exaggerate the opposition, as Plato also recognizes the value of a wise stratagem if it is in the pursuit of the common good. But his question, if we refer to the texts of Gorgias or the Republic, remains the following: can the hero who deceives, even if it is to succeed or achieve a goal deemed noble, remain exemplary from an ethical point of view? Ultimately, in Platonic philosophy, Ulysses' attitude constantly refers to this dilemma. Should one forgive the hero his subterfuges because he acts in the general interest, to save the Greeks, return to his family, or, on the contrary, should one see it as a sign that cunning is always morally suspect when it relies on manipulation of the truth? Thus, when the sophists praise Ulysses for his metis, Plato is more reserved, even critical of a behavior he sometimes equates with an embodied sophism. In this opposition, we can see how Ulysses becomes, for Greek thought, a key figure that reflects two conceptions of language and morality. One, where discourse is an instrument of power, the other where it should rather be the path to a shared knowledge of the truth. In parallel with philosophical debates, Ulysses also serves as a major source of inspiration for tragic authors of the 5th century. Although the Iliad and the Odyssey are the initial references, these poets like to embroider new intrigues or highlight episodes less developed by Homer. Sophocles, one of the 3 great tragedians along with Aeschylus and Euripides, thus dedicates a remarkable play to a post-Trojan episode, Philoctetes. This tragedy, created around 409 BC, illustrates the moral tension embodied by Ulysses. In the play, Ulysses appears as the cunning envoy who must convince Philoctetes, abandoned on a deserted island because of an unbearable wound, to rejoin the Greek camp when it becomes clear that his bow, inherited from Heracles, is indispensable to take Troy. Here, Sophocles stages a manipulative Ulysses, tasked with persuading a deeply betrayed and bitter man to collaborate with those who once left him for dead. The portrait of the Achaean hero is therefore tinged with ambivalence. On one hand, he shows compassion and tries to find the right words to persuade Philoctetes. On the other, he is ready to employ deception and exploit another's distress to achieve his goals. The dramatic interest lies in the fact that Athenian spectators, already familiar with Ulysses through epic tradition, see here a darker aspect of his personality. Sophocles thus shows how cunning can become an instrument of moral constraint, even a lever for manipulation, all while maintaining a goal, the victory considered by the majority as just. In Euripides, the youngest of the 3 great tragedians, the figure of Ulysses reappears in various plays, sometimes in a secondary manner, but always with this mix of veneration and mistrust. One of the few satirical works still available to us, the Cyclops, offers an adaptation directly drawn from the Odyssey, staging the episode where Ulysses and his companions face Polyphemus, the man-eating Cyclops. In this version, brought to the satirical stage, a theatrical genre halfway between tragedy and light comedy, adorned with horse-tailed choruses and music heard as more rhythmic, Ulysses shows cleverness to escape the monster, notably by blinding him after having inebriated him with wine. This mythical incident is known by all the spectators, but Euripides enjoys emphasizing it with comic traits, offering a burlesque portrait of the Cyclops. Ulysses, for his part, retains his ingenuity. His words, his composure, and audacity remain the keys to his triumph. The Athenian public, fond of political or philosophical allusions, could thus once again witness the superiority of the mind over brutality and force, a principle resonating with the political or military debates that agitated the city. Beyond the stage, Ulysses' involvement in classical tragedy extends into iconography. The potters and painters of Attic vases, whose activity flourished particularly between the end of the 6th century and the 4th century BC, abundantly explored Greek heroic feats on cups, craters, or amphorae. The Trojan horse, one of the most striking symbols of Ulysses' cunning, is thus depicted on many ceramics. Generally, you can see a wooden structure, sometimes topped with inscriptions, pulled by armed men or dragged by oxen, while some silhouettes of Greek warriors appear inside the horse. Ulysses' very name is sometimes inscribed on the vase, identified by the artist using a cartouche or a legend in Attic script. Direct scenes of the blinding of the Cyclops also appear, showing Ulysses and his companions wielding a huge stake to pierce Polyphemus's eye. These images, intended for both a local and international market, since Attic pottery was sold throughout the Greek world and even beyond, visually perpetuate the legend of the hero who triumphs over danger through cunning. They also provided, within the context of banquets where these vases were used, material to fuel the oral tale of the exploit. Thus, even without being in the theater, the Greeks could admire on their wine craters or drinking cups scenes reminiscent of the epic, placing Ulysses at the center of a still vibrant collective imagination. To conclude this foray into the reception of Ulysses in the classical era, we can mention a more unexpected episode now preserved in the archaeological collections of Athens. It involves a fragment of an ostracon, that is, a shard of pottery on which an Athenian citizen engraved a name during the procedure of ostracism or a specific public vote. Ostracism, let's remember, was an institution that allowed the assembly to banish an individual deemed too dangerous for the city. Each citizen would then write on a pottery fragment the name of the person they wished to ostracize, and if a vote threshold was reached, that person had to leave Athens for 10 years. In the case that interests us, the ostracon found does not inscribe the name of a real politician like Themistocles or Xanthippos, but that of Odysseus. However, it is obviously not a matter of ostracizing a mythical character, but rather of designating an individual or creating a pseudonym in reference to the cunning that the politician or the anonymous citizen was attributed with. Several interpretations have since been proposed by historians. Some see it as a form of mockery, as if the citizen thought that a prominent politician behaved like Ulysses, manipulative and too clever for the common good. Others still suggest that the voter intentionally wanted to compare himself to the hero, indicating that cunning is sometimes associated with the schemes of rival factions in the assembly. We do not know exactly what year this fragment of ostracon was produced, nor what precise Athenian political context surrounded its inscription. However, this artifact illustrates the extent of Ulysses' notoriety in the collective consciousness of the Athenians. It was evidently clear that writing the name Odysseus on a shard would be immediately understandable to the participants in the vote, whether it was an attack or an ironic identity badge. The symbolic significance of this mythical name is no longer confined to mere literary or artistic reality. It bursts into civic practice and reflects the hero's ambivalence, acclaimed for his intelligence, but potentially feared for those same reasons. The anecdote also bears witness to one thing. In the 5th and 4th centuries BC, history or epic poetry are not mere stories confined to a distant antiquity, but reservoirs of references that continually nourish political and social life. The theater stage, painted ceramics, and today a simple piece of pottery engraved with a name, prove that the past constantly weaves a link with the present. In this context, Ulysses functions as a mirror for the city. He embodies the spirit of initiative, survival in the face of adversity, the finesse of a diplomat able to negotiate, but also the risk of dangerous duplicity. From one generation to the next, the city of Athens, in its imperial rise and later crisis, following the Peloponnesian War, retains within it a fascinated admiration for this hero, mastering eloquence and cunning. The example of the ostracon reveals how, in a democratic system, the mythological is also used to comment on and judge the present. In this respect, Ulysses is not just a remnant of a bygone epic age. He is a living, active symbol of the political, moral, and artistic debate characteristic of the classical era. The period from the 3rd century BC to the 2nd century AD marks a decisive turning point in the way the figure of Ulysses and the Homeric legacy are interpreted, studied, and integrated into Greco-Roman culture. During the Hellenistic era, centered around the city of Alexandria in Egypt, scholars developed tools of critique and philology intended to clarify, comment on, and sometimes reshape ancient texts. This scholarly momentum continues under the Roman Republic and then the Empire. The Homeric myths, particularly those concerning Ulysses' journey, continue to nourish the imagination while provoking a rationalizing debate. The most striking example of this critical endeavor is found in the Library of Alexandria, where philologists like Zenodotus of Ephesus, active at the beginning of the 3rd century BC, and Aristophanes of Byzantium, who succeeded him in the 2nd century, worked. Zenodotus is often considered the first to have attempted a complete critical edition of the Iliad and the Odyssey. He established a text by comparing several versions circulating in different Greek cities. His methods included identifying late editions and removing passages deemed inauthentic. He also noted variants, thus creating a relatively homogeneous reference for the Homeric tradition. Aristophanes of Byzantium, Zenodotus' successor, continued the work of normalizing the Homeric text. His main contribution lies in the establishment of punctuation marks, critical signs, and the division of rhapsodies. Thanks to his influence, the epic song is now divided into 24 distinct songs for each of the Iliad and the Odyssey, facilitating reading and study. Through this systematization, Aristophanes inaugurates an editorial tradition that will have a major impact on the transmission of Homeric works until the Byzantine era, and even beyond. He also addressed questions of language, clarifying the grammatical value of ancient and ambiguous terms. This analytical impetus is not merely an exercise in scholarship for the learned public of Alexandria. Rationalizing heroic episodes, like those associated with Ulysses, responds to a desire to harmonize the epic heritage with the advancements in science, geography, and philosophy of the time. Critical study allows for a clearer distinction between historical fact, poetic myth, and allegorical tradition. Thus, Ulysses begins to be approached not only as a legendary protagonist, but also as an object of literary study and a pretext for speculating on the geographical plausibility of his maritime adventures. During the same period, the Greek historian Polybius in 200 BC inaugurates a practice of confronting mythical narratives with geographical reality. Polybius, known for his history recounting the rise of Rome, is interested in how oral traditions and epic poems correspond to real terrain and distances. Although he does not embark on an exhaustive study of Ulysses' journey, he frequently mentions the coherence of Homeric descriptions. In his analytical framework, the figure of Ulysses becomes an example allowing observation of the boundary between potentially founded history and pure, poetic fiction. Strabo, 64 BC, a geographer and historian of Greek origin, goes a step further in this approach. In his monumental geography, he devotes several sections to examining the places mentioned by Homer, notably the Troad, but also the islands associated with Ulysses in the epic. Seeking to verify the location of Ithaca or the situation of certain ports mentioned in the Odyssey, he endeavors to compare the verses of Homer with information reported by contemporary travelers. His goal is to distinguish, as much as possible, the authentic topography from the literary setting, thereby introducing a comparative method that inspires many minds. Strabo's attempts to identify Ulysses' journeys contribute to the emergence of genuine Homeric tourism during this era. Greek and Roman aristocrats undertake visits to sites renowned for their connection to the epic. Some, eager to validate the authenticity of these places, gather local traditions, testimonies from elders, and all sorts of potential relics. This enthusiasm contributes to a form of cultural pilgrimage. Some go to Troy to contemplate the ruins and imagine the battlefield sung of in the Iliad, while others explore the Ionian Islands to trace a Ulysses who has become quasi-historical. This phenomenon is not confined to the Greek world. With the Roman expansion in the Mediterranean, Rome's cultured elite exhibits a keen interest in Hellenic culture. Many Romans, steeped in the study of Greek, regard Homer as a foundational author. They, too, embark on journeys destined to admire the places celebrated by the epic. The prestige associated with this Homeric pilgrimage also fuels the pride of local populations, who benefit from these curious explorers. Monuments are built, tombs of Ulysses are marked, and guides are offered, transforming the Homeric myth into an intellectual and even economic attraction. At the same time, Latin letters seize the figure of Ulysses, renamed Ulysses or Ulysses. Virgil, the poet at the court of Augustus, thus inserts the character into his Aeneid. However, Ulysses assumes a different role here than in the Odyssey. He becomes the cunning enemy of the Trojans. In the Aeneid, the Trojan hero Aeneas mentions the deceit of Ulysses, notably the episode of the wooden horse, placing the character in a morally ambiguous position. Through this portrayal, Virgil achieves a subtle exercise in transposition, making Aeneas the embodiment of Roman piety against Greek cunning. While Virgil celebrates the founding of Rome and the glory of Aeneas, Ovid is more sarcastic and playful in his depiction of Ulysses. In his Metamorphoses, as well as in his Heroides, he alternates between tragic and ironic tones. Thus, the rivalry between Ulysses and Ajax for the inheritance of Achilles is told from a perspective where the polished word prevails, highlighting Ulysses's oratorical subtlety. Ovid emphasizes the hero's cunning intelligence while adding a touch of mistrust towards this linguistic skill, which can easily turn into the art of manipulation. Seneca, 4 BC, a Stoic philosopher and playwright, also revisits the figure of Ulysses, though more elusively. In his tragedies, he occasionally references the great myths that form the Roman cultural identity, and Ulysses appears as a symbol of moral ambiguity, a man capable of all ruses to survive and triumph, but tormented by incessant psychological unrest. This representation reflects the moral tension specific to the Roman elite of the imperial era, torn between the ideal of virtues, courage, uprightness, and the appeal of keen intellect, even political intrigue at court. Gradually, under the influence of these Latin authors, a new judgment on Ulysses emerges. He is no longer just the traveling hero protected by Athena, but also an archetype of cunning that can slide into deceit, even perfidy. In Roman morality, cunning is not always well regarded, as it clashes with the ideal of candor and virtue upheld by the Republican tradition. Indeed, ingenuity is among the acceptable virtues, but when it crosses the line into lying or cruelty, it raises questions. Thus, Ulysses asserts himself as a literary subject on which many ethical debates crystallize. At the turn of the 5th century AD, Western Europe underwent significant political and cultural transformations. As the Western Roman Empire disintegrated, Christianity, already recognized in the empire since the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, established itself as a new spiritual and institutional force. High-ranking church dignitaries, seeking to establish moral models, turned to the rich ancient heritage. In this context, Homeric figures like Ulysses aroused great interest. Christian authors, influenced by the Church Fathers, interpreted Greek myths through the lens of faith, at times transforming the cunning hero into an allegory of sin or temptation. The Middle Ages, conventionally extending from the 5th to the 15th century, saw the progressive triumph of the Christian vision. Scholars and monks copying ancient manuscripts also adapted the stories of pagan heroes to the religious sensitivities of the time. Thus, Ulysses, whose adventures are associated with exploration, cunning, and the pursuit of knowledge, became an ambiguous symbol for many. Some commentators saw him as a sort of negative example, that of a man too curious, who defies the limits imposed by God. Others, more lenient, regarded his journey as a spiritual quest, a path towards Christian humilitas. One of the most famous medieval interpretations of Ulysses is found in Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, completed in the early 14th century. In Hell, specifically in Canto 26, Dante places Ulysses and Diomedes in a double flame, punished for deceiving the Trojans, notably through the stratagem of the Trojan horse. But it is especially the theme of forbidden curiosity that captures attention. Dante imagines a Ulysses incapable of renouncing discoveries, ready to break all rules to pursue knowledge. This boldness, which Dante considers a sin of pride, condemns him to eternal punishment. For Dante and other Christian scholars of the time, the figure of Ulysses symbolizes the flaw of the human spirit when it prefers worldly wisdom to revealed truths. The episode where the hero, having already survived 1,000 trials, sets out to sail beyond the pillars of Hercules, expresses the temptation to surpass the limits imposed by the Creator. In the Christian perspective, this transgression signifies superbia, that is, excessive pride. Consequently, Dante's Ulysses foreshadows the man who forgets his eternal salvation, blinded by the thirst for discovery and the pride of human intelligence. This allegorical vision of Ulysses resonates with the general trend of the Middle Ages, which appropriated ancient stories but transformed them to conform to religious doctrine. In the wake of Dante, several medieval authors adopted a moralizing tone, highlighting the sinful dimension of the hero. In certain illuminated manuscripts, one can see representations of Ulysses engulfed in flames or involved in scenes where he appears subject to divine judgment. This iconography clearly illustrates the tendency of the time to consider pre-Christian heroes from the perspective of good and evil, placing them in a strict theological framework. At the end of the Middle Ages and the dawn of the Renaissance, perspectives on antiquity evolved significantly. Wars, political upheavals, and the fall of Constantinople in 1453 led to the relocation of many Byzantine scholars to Italy. These scholars brought with them Greek manuscripts previously unknown, contributing to the rediscovery in the West of the original texts of Homer. Humanists, intellectual movements that appeared from the 14th century onwards, restored a central place to ancient sources for thinking about humanity and its relationship to the world. Figures like Giovanni Boccaccio in 1313 and Erasmus of Rotterdam around 1466 became enthusiastic about Hellenic literature, which they sometimes undertook to translate or comment. Boccaccio, author of the Decameron, showed a profound interest in Greek mythology and Homer in particular. Although his texts are not all directly focused on Ulysses, he participated in a broader movement that reevaluated pagan culture. Humanists indeed believed that antiquity was full of intellectual and moral treasures. In Italian schools and academies, Homer was again read in the original language, which marked a major shift after centuries of ignorance of Greek. Comparisons of Latin versions and Greek sources were undertaken, sometimes revealing notable differences in the transmission of the text. Erasmus, for his part, is a scholar of European reputation who promotes the meticulous linguistic study of the scriptures and classical texts. He advocates the idea that one must return to the original, in the case of the Bible, the Hebrew, and the Greek of the New Testament, and for ancient authors, the form closest to their own words. In this context, Ulysses gradually loses his uniformly sinful dimension to become once again a complex hero. Humanists value his intelligence and his skill in overcoming trials, while maintaining a certain critical distance from aspects judged contrary to Christian ethics. Thus, Ulysses is no longer merely synonymous with forbidden curiosity, but also becomes a model of perseverance and prudence. Alongside the humanist effervescence, Renaissance Europe experiences an unprecedented development in cartography. The great voyages of exploration to the Americas, Africa, and Asia prompt monarchs and merchants to equip themselves with increasingly precise maps. It is in this context that Portolan's detailed marine charts indicating coastlines, ports, and strategic maritime routes appear or are perfected. These documents, drafted on parchment, often depict the Mediterranean with particular care, as this sea remains, in the 15th and 16th centuries, a decisive commercial and cultural space. Now, at the heart of these cartographic works, references to Ulysses' journeys continue to flourish. The cartographers of the time, nourished by the renewed reading of ancient texts and by the desire to precisely identify the places mentioned by Homer, attempt to associate real sites with the episodes of the Odyssey. It is thus that they begin to search for the exact location of the island of Circe, the enchantress who allegedly detained Ulysses and his companions. The Portolans sometimes propose extravagant locations, while others are more cautious. During the 15th century, there emerges the hypothesis that the famous island of Circe would actually correspond to Latium, in the central western part of the Italian peninsula, not far from the promontory of Mount Circeo, which indeed gave its name to the mythical figure. This identification finds an echo in the local topography. Mount Circeo, located south of Rome, then constitutes an easily recognizable reference point for sailors. According to folklore tradition, the silhouette of the promontory, seen from afar, would resemble that of an isolated island. Several stories, related to marine caves and secret coves, reinforce the idea that this place could have served as the setting for the myth of Ulysses and Circe. Travelers and scholars therefore rush to observe this coast and compare what they see to Homer's verses. Of course, the absence of conclusive archaeological evidence does not deter the collective imagination, which delights in overlaying the myth onto geography. Over the centuries, these attempts at geographical assimilation illustrate the Renaissance's desire to anchor the legend in reality. The portolans, while primarily designed for navigation, thus integrate mythological annotations, blending the rigor of observation with poetic evocation. Merchants, diplomats, but also adventurers of the Renaissance enjoy evoking Ulysses as a precursor to their own journeys. This reflects a persistent fascination with the Homeric hero, considered at times a fallen sinner, at others an ingenious and courageous man. In any case, the figure of Ulysses serves to link the legendary past to a present in search of new horizons, demonstrating that even at the heart of a changing world, antiquity remains an inexhaustible source of inspiration. In the second half of the 19th century, the idea that the Iliad and the Odyssey might contain a historical basis begins to resurface in Europe. Fascinated by the legendary figure of Ulysses and the saga of the Trojan War, Schliemann harbors a dream: to find the archaeological traces of these epics that many until then considered purely poetic. Driven by extraordinary determination, he embarks on a true quest, convinced that Homer's text indicates more than just a myth. It is towards the hill of Hisarlik in present-day Turkey that he directs his excavations from 1870, convinced that it is the ancient Troy described by the ancients. However, Schliemann's enthusiasm was accompanied by an excavation method that was often criticized. In his early days, he used aggressive techniques that involved quickly digging through thick layers of earth to reach what he called the true Troy. During his initial campaigns, he uncovered a set of remains which he immediately associated with Troy II, estimating that this was the Homeric city, ravaged by war and fire. But later, other archaeologists, including Wilhelm Dörpfeld, Schliemann's assistant and partial successor, identified additional stratigraphic levels, such as Troy VI and Troy VII, which corresponded more closely to the datings closer to the 13th or 12th century BC. Unfortunately, Schliemann's initial excavation destroyed some of the upper layers, complicating the analysis of the site. This confrontation between Troy II and Troy VI-VII already illustrates a methodological turning point. While Schliemann was a pioneer eager to indisputably prove the reality of Homeric Troy, he did not hesitate to force interpretations. The levels he uncovered are of great archaeological richness, but the datings do not always coincide with the supposed events of the Trojan War. Criticisms multiplied. Is it legitimate to unreservedly attribute a treasure or fortifications to an episode described in a poem composed several centuries later? Nevertheless, Schliemann paved the way. He demonstrated to the world that Hisarlik harbored superimposed cities and laid the groundwork for a more systematic approach. Debates about the exact location of Homeric Troy would persist, but now everyone agrees on the real importance of this site for studying the civilizations of Anatolia and the Aegean Sea during the Late Bronze Age. At the turn of the 20th century, another adventure archaeologist, the Englishman Sir Arthur Evans, 1851 to 1941, shifted the focus to Crete. For a long time, the island had been associated with the myth of the Minotaur and the Labyrinth, where the hero Theseus triumphed over the half-man, half-bull creature. In ancient texts, King Minos, a lawgiver and maritime ruler, is mentioned as the guarantor of a powerful island kingdom. Before Evans, the historical reality of the Minoan civilization was still poorly defined. When the archaeologist acquired land at Knossos in 1900, he aimed to reveal a monumental palace. The excavations, undertaken shortly after purchasing the site, indeed revealed complex structures, vast courtyards, staircases, corridors, storage rooms, and craft workshops. Evans saw in this the materialization of the mythical labyrinth. He named this culture Minoan, in reference to Minos, and proposed an evolutionary chronology, divided into early, middle, and late Minoan. However, his architectural reconstruction sparked lively debate. Evans did not just unearth the remains, he restored them based on aesthetic and technical hypotheses that were sometimes controversial. Generous reconstructions in concrete, for example, were added to straighten columns or reconstruct frescoes. Despite these questionable interventions, Evans's contribution is considerable. He highlighted a pre-Mycenaean civilization in Crete, equipped with its own writing system, called Linear A, which remains partially undeciphered. He proved that Crete was inhabited by a flourishing and sophisticated society, with organized palaces and refined art, long before Mycenaean development on the Greek mainland. Evans's findings paint a picture of a world in which the myth of the Minotaur appears as a distorted reflection of a grand reality. Not a real monster, but a vast palace complex, whose architecture could recall the winding nature of a labyrinth. Thus, where Schliemann had sought Homer's Troy, Evans searched for King Minos' palace. Through their work, archaeology gained public visibility, and the idea of rediscovering epic worlds gained traction on the international stage. While Schliemann and Evans made a significant impact at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries, another great American archaeologist, Carl W. Bleegen, 1887-1971, continued investigations in the first half of the 20th century. Bleegen first focused on Pylos in the southwestern Peloponnese in mainland Greece. Ancient sources present Pylos as the kingdom of the wise king Nestor, one of the aged heroes of the Homeric epic. Between 1939 and 1952, Bleegen conducted systematic excavations in this region and unearthed an extensive palatial complex, now called the Palace of Nestor. His team discovers numerous tablets in Linear B, a writing system used by the Mycenaeans, that is, by the Greeks living in the late Bronze Age. The revelation is significant as these administrative tablets prove that Mycenaean society had an advanced bureaucracy, cataloging agricultural productions, distributions of goods, and sometimes lists of soldiers. One of the most remarkable discoveries concerns the inventory of rowers, as identified by Bleegen and his colleagues as a list of men assigned to a fleet. To explain the maritime wars and the political commercial expansion of Mycenae and its vassals, these documents bridge the complex reality of the end of the Bronze Age and the epic tradition. This suggests that the ships described in the Iliad, or the black-hulled ships dear to the bards, are not purely literary inventions. They might correspond to navies recorded in the palace archives. At the same time, Carl Bleegen continues excavations at Troy, still on the site of Hissarlik, hoping to clarify the dating of the various layers. He establishes that Troy 7th, and not Troy II, offers a more plausible dating for the alleged period of the Trojan War, around 1250-1200 BC. The walls of Troy 7th, imposing and reinforced, seem compatible with a prolonged siege. Moreover, signs of fire and abandonment suggest a major conflict or a natural disaster. Bleegen's conclusions, less spectacular than those of Schliemann, are nevertheless part of a more rigorous approach. It is then understood that Homer's Troy might resemble this level 7th, without yet being able to specify if it is truly the city besieged by the Achaeans described in the Iliad. In any case, the international press is fascinated by the matter. Bleegen consolidates the link between Homeric poems and archaeological discoveries, while remaining cautious about an automatic identification. With the rapid advances in earth sciences and analytical techniques, the 20th century sees chronology becoming more refined. Archaeology, once based on empirical observation of soil layers and stylistic cross-referencing of objects, receives support from more exact disciplines. Dendrochronology, for example, allows the study of the growth rings of wood. By comparing sequences of ancient tree rings, researchers are able to set precise milestones in time. For a site like Troy, where construction wood is occasionally found, this method contributes to bringing archaeology closer to scientific certainty. If a beam sample dates back to the end of the 13th century BC, a concrete benchmark is obtained for the potential period of conflicts. In parallel, ground-penetrating radar revolutionizes the prospecting of the subsoil without requiring destructive excavations. On the modern island of Ithaca, associated with Ithaca, the kingdom of Ulysses, some exploration campaigns use this method from the second half of the 20th century, then more intensively in later decades. The radar emits electromagnetic waves that bounce off geological formations and any buried remains, allowing a preliminary mapping. The identified sites can thus be excavated sporadically or tested by coring, reducing the risk of missing buried structures or destroying important levels. Even though concrete evidence of a palace of Ulysses remains scarce, each survey refines the understanding of the ancient landscape, revealing the trace of ancient fortifications or remains of ancient dwellings. Machism. Another technical novelty, developed during the 20th century and still being perfected today, involves analyzing the chemical composition of ceramics and metals through lead isotope studies. Each metal deposit has a specific isotopic signature linked to the ratio of certain lead isotopes in the ore. By comparing the found objects, one can reconstruct a route for the circulation of raw materials or finished goods. Thus, copper ingots discovered on a shipwreck off Asia Minor can be linked to mines in Cyprus. Ceramics found at sites in the Peloponnese can be associated with a Cretan workshop or a Cycladic workshop. This technique proves crucial for clarifying the trade routes between mainland Greece, Crete, Anatolia, and the Near East during the time when the Homeric heroes supposedly lived. The myth of a grand coalition of Greek cities led by King Agamemnon setting out to besiege Troy resonates with the reality of complex exchange networks, the extent of which is verified through the origin of materials. Without proving the actual existence of King Odysseus, or a conflict identical to that described by Homer, these scientific methods consolidate the idea that a Mycenaean elite, powerful and connected to major trade routes, ruled over the Aegean Sea. Around the mid-20th century, the rise of the humanities and the advent of new technologies transformed the study of ancient heroes. Odysseus, once a simple epic protagonist, became a subject of cross-disciplinary research combining linguistics, anthropology, genetics, and scientific modeling. From 1950 to 2025, these fields examined the legendary figure of the King of Ithaca from a new angle in order to untangle the historical reality from the mythical component. Major advances, such as radiocarbon dating and statistical analysis, have helped better delineate the framework within which the Odyssey is set, revealing a complex fabric of fact and fiction. From a linguistic perspective, the onomastics of Odysseus occupy a central place in understanding the evolution of ancient Greek and its connections with other languages of the Eastern Mediterranean. The name Odysseus is sometimes translated as he who causes pain or he who is angry, emphasizing an essential characteristic of this hero, the suffering he undergoes or inflicts. Starting in the 1950s, philologists scrutinized the Homeric texts to analyze the presence of derivative forms of the verb odusomai, to hate, to bear a grudge. Their findings highlight a strong link between the name Odysseus and the notion of torment, confirming the idea that his fate is closely tied to trials. Simultaneously, the comparative study of Hittite tablets has aroused growing interest. Some specialists have suggested that the figure of Tawagalawa mentioned in Hittite diplomatic documents may echo characters from the Achaean tradition. Even though the Tawagalawa-Odysseus connection remains speculative, it is part of an approach aimed at identifying possible cultural transfers between the Ahiyawa, a Hittite term possibly designating the Achaeans, and the Anatolian world. The archives of Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, describe negotiations and alliances with other kingdoms, providing a historically credible backdrop to the interactions later evoked in the Homeric epic, Tarathian. Comparative anthropology has renewed the perspective on Odysseus by approaching him as a marine trickster, meaning a character both cunning and transgressive. In traditional societies, the trickster is defined by his ability to circumvent rules, deceive his enemies, and sometimes even his allies. This approach compares Odysseus to Coyote among the Navajos of North America, or to Maui in Polynesian tales. In these legendary figures, cunning is not just a means to achieve goals. It becomes an essential mechanism for surviving in a hostile environment and transmitting knowledge to the community. Studies conducted from the 1970s have highlighted several invariants specific to these tricksters: the fine line between heroism and mischief, a close connection with the sea or natural elements, and a propensity to reshape the established order. Throughout the stories, Odysseus deceives Polyphemus, avoids the Sirens, and escapes inextricable situations thanks to his intelligence alone. Similarly, Coyote sometimes rearranges the world to serve humanity, while Maui fishes islands out of the ocean. This parallel suggests that Odysseus belongs to a vast repertoire of cunning heroes whose exploits were transmitted orally before being fixed in literature. Geneticists have turned to the study of ancient DNA to identify possible concrete traces of the people who might have produced a historical Odysseus. Since the 1990s, several excavation campaigns on the island of Lefkis, off the western coast of Greece, have allowed for the examination of human remains dating back to the Bronze Age. The analyses, focusing on mitochondrial and nuclear sequences, aim to determine the degree of continuity between Mycenaean populations and contemporary inhabitants of the region. Notable genetic similarities suggest that an ancient gene pool has been preserved, despite the historical upheavals following the fall of the Mycenaean civilization. However, this continuity neither proves the real existence of Odysseus nor his precise origin. The results merely emphasize that part of the current population likely descends from groups already present in the 2nd millennium BC. Experts thus stress the difference between analyzing entire populations and identifying a legendary individual. Furthermore, numerous external influences might have blended with the initial core due to successive migrations. The central idea, however, is that the inhabitants of these islands may have preserved oral traditions over several centuries, shaping the image of their hero, whether inspired by a real person or purely mythical. With the rise of computer technology, the analysis of Odysseus's supposed maritime roots has utilized numerical modeling. In the 2000s, multidisciplinary teams developed algorithms incorporating the geographic layout of the Eastern Mediterranean, the winds, currents, and the speed of light galleys with 20 oars. The goal was to verify the plausibility of certain stops described in Books 9 to 20 of the Odyssey, particularly the journey to the Cyclops, or the lengthy detour past the island of Aeolus. The results showed that while some segments match a navigable scheme, others diverge significantly from any historical plausibility. Full-scale reconstructions, conducted in pools or along Greek coasts, have supplemented the simulations. Objections arise regarding the often fantastical dimension of the adventures, which science cannot validate. Nonetheless, engineers and historians insist on the value of these tests. They allow for assessing the gap between epic fiction and the real constraints of the Aegean Sea. Sometimes, the comparisons reveal well-documented empirical knowledge about adverse winds or currents, reflecting the maritime expertise of a seafaring people. This delicate balance between nautical realism and poetic embellishment illustrates the dynamic inherent to the tale of Odysseus. In light of these discoveries, Odysseus appears as a figure oscillating between history and legend. On one hand, he symbolizes the collective memory of Achaean sailors navigating the Aegean Sea. On the other hand, he embodies a legendary hero whose fantastic adventures fueled the Greek imagination. This synergy is reflected in the evidence compiled so far, where archival analysis and contemporary methodologies intersect to shed light on the narrative. Thus, we can address the central question: what do the material and textual remnants actually reveal about the possible existence of Odysseus? Archaeological discoveries from Mycenae and Troy 7th, along with Hittite texts mentioning the Ahiawa, confirm the existence of a context of rivalries and interactions between the Aegean and Anatolia at the turn of the 13th century BC. Fortified palaces, linear bead tablets, and repeatedly burned cities depict a backdrop of commercial exchanges, but also of violent conflicts. However, no document from that period explicitly cites a leader named Odysseus. To explain this gap, some historians point to oral tradition, potentially leaving no immediate written trace. The epic, therefore, might have stylized the experience of real sailors without necessarily referring to a unique individual. Socially, Odysseus embodies a model of survival and adaptation, resonating with peoples subjected to political uncertainty and climatic vagaries. While Achilles illustrates direct bravery, Odysseus exemplifies resilience and diplomatic skill. In ancient Greece, these qualities echoed the daily realities of island communities, negotiating a sea passage, finding limited resources, or escaping invaders. Homeric tales having circulated for centuries, they crystallized a collective ideal, while Greek diasporas, in establishing new colonies, carefully preserved the image of this traveling hero to cement their identity cohesion. Thus, the character of Odysseus also serves as a mirror for Greek migrations. Emigrants carried with them, besides their material goods, a cultural baggage composed of epic tales. The figure of the king of Ithaca, wandering from island to island, illustrates the determination to overcome exile, loyalty to a distant home, and mastery of speech. In newly founded cities, the evocation of Odysseus maintained a sense of common belonging, reminding everyone that intelligence and flexibility can prevail against the worst adversities. Over time, this myth became a reservoir of political, moral, or philosophical references that classical, then Hellenistic Greece constantly revisited. In recent decades, the hero's legend has penetrated various fields of study, ranging from pedagogy to technological research. Advances in artificial intelligence are beginning to offer automated analyses of Homeric texts, seeking to identify their layers of composition and distinguish possible later contributions. Likewise, the rise of underwater archaeology, with the help of increasingly sophisticated submersibles, promises new discoveries on ancient maritime routes. Unknown shipwrecks could unveil unprecedented information on the circulation of goods, highlighting the importance of maritime adventure in the Aegean culture that gave birth to the myth of Odysseus.